In this movie, we're going to draw forth still more color using a vibrance adjustment layer, and along the way, you'll see just how different its saturation control works. So for starters, I'll go ahead and bring up my adjustments panel, and then I'll Alt-click or Option-click on the vibrance icon, which is the last one in the first row, in order to bring up the new layer dialog box. And I'll call this guy noiseless color, let's say, because we are going to use vibrance to quell some of that color noise. And then I'll click OK. All right, now notice if I go ahead and crank the saturation value all the way up to plus 100, we don't have any of that color garbage that we saw when we cranked up the saturation value that's associated with hue saturation. And that's because the two controls work very differently. Notice what happens if I turn off that hue saturation layer. The saturation value really doesn't have anything to do anymore. And that's because it requires at least moderately saturated colors to do any good. So what I'm going to do is crank it all the way up to 100 once again, then turn on the hue saturation layer, and then zoom in on my image by Control Spacebar or Command Spacebar clicking. Notice we do have some color noise at work inside of this purple coral, but that is not the fault of the vibrance layer. That is instead the fault of the hue saturation layer. So I'll go ahead and select it, and if necessary, double-click on its thumbnail in order to bring up the Properties panel, and then I'll click in the saturation value, and I'll press Shift-down arrow a couple of times in order to reduce the color noise, as we're seeing here. Now, of course, that doesn't totally get rid of it, but it makes a big, huge difference. Now, I'll go ahead and select the vibrance layer once again, and I'll take its saturation value down to plus 70, let's say. And then I'll go ahead and zoom out from the image by pressing Ctrl-0 or Command-0 on the Mac. And I'll select the vibrance value, which I can do, of course, by pressing Shift-Enter here on the PC or Shift-Return on the Mac. And I'll go ahead and crank it up to its maximum. And then I'll press Shift-Down arrow a couple of times in order to reduce that value to 80. So in other words, we have a saturation value of 70. And then where hue saturation is concerned, we have a saturation value of plus 60. At which point, I'll go ahead and hide the Properties panel so that we can better see the image on screen. I also want you to see what's going on with the channels. So I'll go up to the Window menu and choose the Channels command in order to bring up my Channels panel. And now notice the differences between the red channel, which we're seeing now. Notice that it's quite noisy in this area of coral. And then if I switch to the green channel, we have a very different looking effect. And then when I switch to the blue channel, things are more different still, with a very bright sky and some very dark coral. And that is definitely quite different than what we were seeing in the red channel, for example, which is why when I switch back to the full color composite, we're seeing such a spectacularly colorful image. All right, now I'll go back to the Layers panel and I'll Alt or Option click on the background. That is the image as it appeared at the beginning of the previous movie, and that's the image as it appears now, thanks to our ability to draw color out of even the most drab image using a hue saturation adjustment layer, and then enhance those colors that much further using a vibrance adjustment layer here inside Photoshop.